Good morning. Welcome. It's such a pleasure to be able to moderate this second table here at Culturopolis. We're gonna give them a second so Patrice and Lucina can connect with interpreters. I'm not gonna introduce them officially because you have all their information in the website. But I am gonna say that this panel will allow us to see this from three very different points of view. Patrice is a philosophy professor, and he works in Fribourg. It's a pleasure to have him here. Lucina is one of the main experts in public politics, also in cultural law, and Jordi is one of the artists, activists of cultural rights, young and representative. He represents the manifest, and it's going to be great to be able to talk about it with him. When we talk about cultural rights, we talk about laws. We talk about responsibilities from governments, like the mayor said yesterday. In this country, cultural laws, we started working on them since 1980, and most of them were created between that moment and 2010, both in Catalonia and national level. These laws protect the cultural patrimony, libraries, archives, intellectual property, and they want to avoid the destruction of the heritage. But then there was a change of point of view, and these laws that were very focused on artists start focusing on citizens. And Freiburg's declaration in 2018 started narrowing down the part of the cultural right that was in the Article 27 of the Human Rights Declaration. Why did it take us so long to specify this right that was specified in the human rights? Why are they like the second or third generation right? Maybe it's because it's difficult to link what we were talking about yesterday, is the diversity of origins and cultural practices with the universal manner of human rights. That's why I wanted to start this board asking Patrice if cultural rights can really be universal, can really be for everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to join here today. And of course, I would like to say thank you to the City Council of Barcelona. We've been working for 25 years together, and I've visited several times. Especially, I would like to thank Eduardo. And together we have learned lots of things that has allowed us to contribute to the creation of this movement that goes beyond Fribourg. Why it took us so much time to get here? That's what I would like to answer, to reach universality, because it's too radical, it's too strong. It means accepting that every individual, every man, every woman has the right to be recognized as capable of knowing, as capable of contributing to society, of contributing with specific and original knowledge. But for this, it's not enough to give people freedom of expression. People need to have tools. everyone,
en
every man,
principe
every
la
woman
capacité et c'est sa
has
dignité
the capacity
d'être reconnu comme
of
capable de
being
savoir,
recognized
comme capable
as
de
capable of knowing
reconnaître son paysage, de
and
reconnaître ses parents, de
acknowledging
reconnaître
and
sa
recognizing
mémoire,
their
de reconnaître ses
landscape,
communautés, son peuple,
their
ses
memories, their
enfants, de
communities,
reconnaître
their
les arts, les
relatives,
sciences,
of
mais en même
appreciating arts and
pour que ce
culture.
droit soit effectif,
But on the other side, for this right to be effective, it's necessary to guarantee the conditions of participation in culture. Not, let's say, participating in the life of culture, no. When I say this, I mean accessing culture. Of course, we have inequality problem, and of course, we have great inequalities that hinder these rights. So, how can we guarantee this right, this direct access to culture? Between someone who is suffering, for example, and those who have the capacity of giving a response. We need to know when the inequalities are worse. We need to recognize when inequalities are really hard, even worse than social, economical inequalities. Inequalities that at the same time justify political turbulence. But this is just an excuse. Because when we are in front of someone, in face of someone that's suffering, we see it. We see the universal character of their suffering. So, which response, which reaction can I have to someone who's greatly suffering? How can we? How it's possible that the way we associate, the way we join together, we're not able to reach a real democracy yet that guarantees the access of all to different kinds of knowledge? Of course, we know that right now the situation is worse than ever. We're suffering a war in Europe. And of course, we're starting to see that we're not going to reach any of the goals of the millennium because they're not based specifically on any of the human rights. For example, we do not recognize the right to participation. These goals of the millennium do not recognize these rights, and the different cultural realities and of other rights are not recognized. The rights that should acknowledge the relationship of humans with other elements, as for example, the environment, and that guarantee the participation in scientific dissemination. Also, the right to participating in maintaining different environments, natural and urban environments, should be recognized. Let's remember too that to participate in the right to healthcare, we need to have information and contribute to this information. We need to have knowledge about this dimension, which is very central to the cultural area. Today we're going to talk about culture and the cultural sector as if it were something independent, when it's in the base of all the capacities and all the skills and the empowerment of all areas. And this is something revolutionary. Who is willing to admit that an individual or a family who is impoverished, these people are a testimony of what doesn't work in society? Because we have this principle of intersectionality. These families suffer different kinds of discrimination. And of course, that affects the way they react. At the end of the day, the cultural sector is not something aside, it's something that's central, because at the end of the day, trees, education, religion, information, art, it's a part of culture. The relationship between what's cultural and education is not only a matter of new technologies, it's not a matter of fake news. No. The problem is that when we accept that lies are normal in politics, we accept they're normal in any field of life. And we need to solve this. So it is not a matter of orientating cultural rights towards citizenship. We need to put the citizenship in the center of cultural rights as in the rest of the human rights, change our political norms, our political laws. And this not only affects states, it affects everyone, different peoples, different citizens, both from an idealist, let's say, point of view, but also from a practical way of view. So, the starting point, well, we didn't even reach the starting point to start changing this. We need to start addressing very, very basic elements of the cultural rights. Starting being aware of our rights and obligations in a more strict way, to fight against separation. We need to fight against the dismembering, so to say, of cultural arts, of their separation. For me, this has no sense whatsoever. Because any kind of education, there's no cultural education, because all education, all training is formal. That's why in culture it's also important to take in account the right to education and the right to participate and to benefit from an education. That's how cultural richness is transmitted. And it's inherited. And so, at the same time, we cannot give more importance to artistic education rather than scientific education, because all they're important and they're all tied to culture. And it's also important, taking this into account, that we need to tie our inner world with our exterior world. Culture is in our essence, but also it's present during our social life, when we share a meal with someone. Culture is everywhere. A food is not only a food by itself, for example. It's something symbolic. Because it's when we're like sharing a food, we're sharing what's outside and what's inside within us. That's why we need to work on the different rights, education, the right to participation, to share and to have access to quality cultural tools and to benefit from them, and to if we don't do this, the cultural sector will always be set aside, will be something marginalized. We have several examples of this, and to improve them, for example, we have a musical activity in a popular neighborhood. We see that different music activities can contribute to like kind of like free society. At the same time, we not only need a soft power in culture, we need a hard power coming from the political forces to boost these. Let's remember that the object and subject of the right is people and not cultural, so it's necessary a collective work, so to circulate knowledge, to be able to recognize ourselves, our rights and obligations, and to vindicate the right of recognition, to recognize myself, to recognize the other, to recognize each other, and to do so it's necessary to be able to recognize trees, songs, landscape, music, cities. In order to do this, we need to share everything everywhere, to take on the streets, to do it in our kitchens, and to recognize the different kinds of knowledge that exist. At the same time, we need to recognize our languages. We need to recognize our freedoms, our cultural freedoms. We don't talk about them enough, and also our cultural obligations. And to recognize that all as citizens we do have responsibilities. I will end with a definition. We could say that we have the right to recognize and to be recognized, but we also, everyone has the right, because for example someone who writes or reads needs these inside freedom, this linguistic freedom, this artistic freedom, but to enjoy this freedom, it needs to be shared. This is something that happens in common. However, that doesn't make this person in its solitude we can still enjoy these freedoms and these obligations alone with our dignity, but we can only fully enjoy it when we share it. And that's why we all need to be able to participate and to access different forms and cultures, in able to be able to live their identification processes all along their lives, to enjoy quality cultural tools. What are they? What are these resources? Here is where the real inequalities show up. Some people within the education sector that are desperate. We need to give a description of what's a quality tool, of what is excellence. Because when we talk about quality, we need to talk about excellence as well. Because, for example, we have excellent musicians, but we also need excellent scientists and excellent politicians, which is not always the case. In this regard, we could talk, when it comes to cultural rights, about hope, because it's not only a power dynamic, a matter of people. We do have cultural resources, tools, heritage resources, but we also have not only we have architectural patrimonies, we also have religious patrimonies, linguistic ones, democratic culture patrimonies, which is still kind of weak. And only through the sharing of these patrimony can we wake each other up. Because we don't have to have on the one side the teacher and on the other side the student. No. We need to learn from each other. It's not something unidirectional. And only like this we will have an interpreting space, a dialectic space. And this is the principle of an authentic democratic culture. This is the base of any kind of radical democracy.
Thank you very much, Patrice.
Ayer hablábamos en la primera mesa de este vínculo entre participar en la vida cultural y democracia, ¿no? Y en la conexión
We
directa
talked
entre
yesterday.
este sistema cultural y la garantía
Unfortunately, the interpreter cannot interpret because the microphone is not on.
gestionar conflictos. Pero esto hay que aterrizarlo, Lucina, luego en políticas
We are going to
públicas,
talk about
hay que
this
aterrizarlo
later,
en nuevas
Lucina.
leyes. En estos
We're going to
momentos
talk about
también
new
aquí,
laws.
en Navarra se ha
Here
aprobado
in
hace poco
Navarra,
una nueva ley que ya
there's
es
a
ley
new
de
law that has been approved,
culturales, también
the
en
law
Canarias
for
está
cultural
circulando
rights, also
cultural.
in the Canary Islands.
En Madrid se defendió
In
hace poco
Madrid,
una propuesta que no avanzó,
there was a
pero
new
estaba ahí.
proposal. And in Catalonia, there's also a project to create a cultural law, and there's a plan, a politic with very specific measures from Mexico, and as an expert in an international level, how is the situation law-wise? This need to respect the individual, the intimacy and the right of communities, cultural rights. How do you see this?
Thank you very much, Gemma. I would like to, first of all, say that I'm really, really happy to be here. Coming to Europe has costed me a pandemic, and we had to suffer. I would like to say thank you to the City Council of Barcelona and the network of cities and local governments, because being here allowed me to reflect on something in a joint way. So we're talking about a sector that, its development was quite slow, because of course it vindicates, let's say, it puts the status quo in question. And when we talk, the first time we talked of cultural rights in Mexico, they were kind of set aside because at that moment the main conversations were about human rights. In a moment where it was being said that the human rights should be an integral part of any kind of policy, with establishing a new relationship between politics, state, and citizenship, and recreating public policies. And within this context, cultural rights were a new reality with lots of doubts. I remember the movement of the civil society, which was responsible for the promoting of these kind of rights. And the hardest part of these debates was to include cultural rights within human rights. Because it was said that culture cannot be a part of the law. The important part was to establish people as subjects of this law. And then the question arose, what are cultural rights? What are laws referring to when they talk about cultural rights? So we needed a categorization of several rights that need to be in a minimum but universal way. They need to be guaranteed that way. And so a conversation started, very extended horizontal conversation all across lots of sectors. We talked about the dignity of people and how it should be an essential pillar within rights. We were talking about the right to build an identity, which is an ongoing process, because identities are not stable, and identity should not be something that's determined by external agents. Identities are built in a collective environment, but of course, at the same time, these identities should be built in total freedom. And for us to have freedom, we need diversity. We need plural diversities, not just one diversity. And if we are recognizing these rights we need to talk about how we put in value not agreeing of discrepancy, and how discrepancy is a mechanism that puts everything upside down. That's why it's such a challenge to talk about cultural rights within public policies, because it transforms the basis of the states. It changes the basis of the relationships within culture and citizenship. In the case of Mexico,
eso es un desplazamiento a un derecho ciudadano, no a una función de Estado. Eso no le corresponde al Estado.
In the case of Mexico, the state was reticent to the fact of accepting cultural rights as citizen rights. What Patrice said is very important, and I want to highlight it as well. Excellence is very important, and we need to remember also diversity is sometimes mistaken by tradition. And that's not correct, because for there to be traditions, we need innovation, for them to become active and to have a real sense within communities as a transformation tool. At the same time, this implies a transformation of cultural ecosystems, and that's why I think this is the phase we're in debates about cultural rights. We're talking about transformations, because these transformations are changing the relationship between consumers and producers. This is not the vision that cultural rights should have, even when the right to access to some services and some assets is recognized. The rights to access, these should be guaranteed. But at the same time, this is not enough, and the structures should be transforming the relationships between individuals and the practices. Now we're talking about creativity, because at the end of the day, cultural practices should take place in a diverse environment with freedom, and the government, the state, should not be putting limits to this diversity, which is so necessary. Because if they do so, they're limiting what real diversity is. That's what we need to be thinking about, reflecting on. It is also very important, the right to access scientific knowledge and to access digital spaces. It's very important because it means to integrate the transmission of information to our daily lives, and allows us to create content. Some states knew the creation of new measures in these regards. And the state shouldn't be putting limits on what the citizenship can enjoy. At the end of the day, the new measures should guarantee that the citizens can enjoy these new spaces. It's also true that the management of cultural rights requires some laws, some environments, even they demand specific financing policies. And in that regard, I think there's an interesting discussion about how these new financing schemes can be put in place, or the strengthening of social economy or circular economies. Because at the end of the day, remember that these new cultural rights demand we abandon the neoliberal way of thinking. I believe that right now little cultural community organizations are having great efforts in different environments. So, for example, in indigenous peoples and in small spaces, they're generating new relationships that are much more equal, having a different vision about sustainability as well. I would like to mention sustainability right now. We have social sustainability on the one hand, which is very important because communities need to participate very deeply in these processes, but also sustainability from from a management perspective, so to speak. That means how can we make sure that our actions today do not hinder future generations? Not in any way, not in environmental ways. That's why we cannot separate public policies from culturals, and we cannot leave aside the environmental component neither. We need to leave aside this anthropocentric vision that believes that nature needs to be sacrificed for our own good and the development of the human being. There's a really deep relationship between different beings that are also related to cosmovisions, so we cannot just talk about one model of sustainable development. No, we have lots of possibilities. Not even models, maybe we will have different ways of developing new ways. And there are different cosmovisions that put nature in their center. This could even change the vision we have about intellectual property and the different ways of protection, which is also a right, because there is an ongoing debate about cultural products, who they belong to, especially where different peoples, different communities have been taking care, so to speak, of different kinds of knowledge that are not under any laws, so to speak. And in order to protect this, many things need to be changed at a global level, because new laws can imply the restriction, the limiting of the enjoyment of these ways of knowledge. At the same time, we need to create new ways of protection that guarantees for communities to enjoy and to access and to recreate different kinds of culture. And lastly, I would like to say that right now, cultural rights are not linked to sustainability, but these need to change because we need a parameter to create different ways to fight against inequality. As we know, inequalities can be very deep, and it's deeply rooted in the production means of society. And I think the capacity of creating new imaginaries is what today could change not only the future but also the present of communities that have been classified as impoverished communities. They're being classified as that because a certain cultural notion is being interpreted. Also, it's important to see how we're going to change everything from public policies, not only culture-wise, but also healthcare-wise. We need to have the cultural component in all of these policies, and that's why we need the states and the governments to recognize that, for example, we need gender vision in about the streets, about the city. I think in this regard, the diversities are very active, very clear, and that's why I think the speech of cultural rights, from a point of view of the cultural rights, can be in some sectors extremely conflictive, and that's why we need to make space for these kind of discussions. We cannot transform cultural rights and culture without conflict, because at the end of the day, conflict is the powerhouse of change. And so we need to put more value to our discrepancies in order to be able to advance. Thank you very much.
Jordi.
Don't ask me about laws because we're gonna finish really early. I think you have the perfect profile to deal with these topics as an artist and a person who is engaged with citizens through art. What they were talking about right now, understanding culture as an element that allows us to link it all, to understand not only from cultural policies, but also feminism policies, environmental policies. Art has been evident for a long time because artists are the clear example of how culture changes us and how when artists and how artists apply this to social transformation, acting through art. What do you think? First of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think today I should not focus on who or what, but on how. These topics have been discussed for a long time, but I think it's surprising that they still seem new. Not only in the street, but in the cultural institutions. I'm going to overshare a bit because I tell parts of my life, but I think I'm a good example of why cultural rights should be in the institutions and should radiate outside. I am from a neighborhood called Camp de l'Arpa, next to Sant Pau Hospital. Oh, look, a slide. Perfect. It's one of the neighborhoods that took the longest to get a library. I think it was in 2010. I was born in 1982, and when I started high school in a high school called Margan, in Diagonal, there was a small cultural center that many will recognize as Caixa Forum, but in that moment, it was located in a different place. Is there anybody who relates to that? For me, that was crucial, as well as everything that my colleagues said, for building a person in a context, a diverse person. I'm going to leave it here because I don't want to ever share more. But in that moment, I decided, fuck the lessons. In that moment, it was more important to be there because that center had the doors always open. It had amazing programs, and it had Mediatek. It was a place with free Wi-Fi when it wasn't that common to have Wi-Fi at home. It had CDs, DVDs with the first performances recorded. I remember watching Marina Abramovic and having my mind blown. All of this for free. I felt at home when I got there. And this idea of opening the doors is something I really like. sadly, this is only my story. When we understood that this made sense, and they understood that the Mediatek was full, they changed it, they transformed it into what it is now. Now you have to pay for it to get in there. The Mediatek became a space for entrepreneurship, and the other place is now for AR, PR. Now we can see all the spectrum of how culture works, diversifies, transforms, and it's, at the end of the day, a service. I have to proudly say that this cultural center transformed me as a citizen, as an artist, and as an educator. And my mission in this cultural sector is perpetuate this idea of shared spaces with open doors so citizens can feel like they belong in there. I don't know if you can see it right in the slide. And bringing this perspective of practitioner, a person who creates projects. This is a project that we created in Central Santa Monica at the beginning of the year with Alba Rie, that was here wearing her pajamas, and with another great educator. The three of us asked ourselves how to make that a school in the neighborhood that has high complexities comes to this cultural center. Why do we want them to get closer to this cultural center? Just to check their entry? For them to see the expositions? Is it important for us that the kids see these expositions? Why? To provide culture? Do they have a culture that could be interesting in this context? We had many questions going on in our heads. And so what we decided was, first of all, to listen. And in my new job, in Manifesta, this by this project that we do every 2 years, we are collecting information on what are the wishes, desires of these communities. We realize that this stigma of high complexity schools is very heavy because it is understood that this school is like a ghetto, bringing the kids there. It is so. This is a problem of income. What this does is that it allows them to eat there. It's not that there are conflicts in the classroom. It's just a situation of vulnerability. So what we decided with my colleagues and also with the direction of the school, to whom I really thank, and also to the teachers. So, more than bringing the students there, making the center become like their school. And for that, what we did was what you saw in the first slide, was to take the tag with the name of the school, with the public school. Yeah, we took it. Yeah, thank you. We took it, Escola de las Anas, and what we did was walk with the giant, we are talking about traditions. This was very important. We had to have a giant in the school. So Maria, the giant, was leading the parade, and all the boys and girls had all the material. They were on an excursion. They were going to spend a week in the cultural center, and what we did was place the school in the center of the center. I think in the next slide we can see it. When we got there, we placed the school tag right next to the name of the exposition. Here's when we brought it down. What we did is place it right next to the other tag, and so everybody knew that there was an exposition, but there was also a school that was working there. And this is in Las Ramblas. I was the giant. I was underneath the giant. It was very, very heavy. And what we did during that week was all the formal content of the school. And here we have to thank a lot the teachers, who did a great job, as always. That is not always recognized. So what we did is we applied this formal content to the content of the exposition. So, for example, if we were talking about gastronomy or colonialism in the exposition, that could lead to the teacher, the social science teacher, to take that exposition and use it in her class. It was very interesting to see how the spaces in the museum were used. It was great. All of a sudden, many tourists came because it was at the end of the Ramblas, and they could see many kids taking notes in front of a piece of art. And this generated on students a situation of feeling privileged, because not all schools have the chance to do this, but also it was the teachers told us that the students were so used to being enclosed in the school in small places, and all of a sudden they were in a big room, and instead of a desk they had like a booth. And with all these activities they felt more engaged. They asked more questions. I think I've talked too much. I'm sorry. I only wanted to say that it was also very interesting to see how the museum adapts to the school, how the terrace of Santa Monica became the playground, and other spaces became the canteen to eat lunch. No, that's not what we're talking about. This is from Manifesta. If I have time later, I'll talk about it. So this idea of porosity is very important, because museums have this function. They're like the crown. They have to accompany all the content that is dealt with at school. The museum has become like a bourgeois idea that has nothing to do with schools, and if you ask me, I think we should try to explain that we could still link these two sectors, and it's very useful. We've seen it during the COVID pandemic. I think it's essential. Patrice, you were telling us about the need to understand culture as this keystone of other politics. And I think we're going forward thanks to other key aspects in our day-to-day life that are also very present. One of them is migration, how people move, and that forces us to question human rights and place dignity in the center. And in education, the right of education is telling us that education is a cultural right. I think there are two more revolutions going on that make us see that it might be possible to have this intersection between different sectors. One is feminism and the other one is ecology. The need to survive, not only the planet, but us. Do you think we are achieving that cultural rights are understood from this point of view of cultural rights, and that they they have a dialogue with the other rights?
I think it's difficult. Universality is based, it's characterized by its interdependency. And this is something that's repeated all again and again on official documents. But some states do not believe this is true. So we need a basic foundation. Cultural rights need to be in the center of the rights. It needs to be in the center of the rights to be the, let's say, creators of our own rights. However, we're being hindered by the great weight of ignorance. And there are always disruptions, and people who are against this succeed in separating these rights. Jordi gave very good examples. He talked about the rights, education, he talks about museums, and of course that's all about cultural rights. And so there is a strategical link, a very, very practical link between the right to ongoing training all along our lives, which is, this is what the report says, and there's a link between this right and the right to information and the right to participate and to obtain quality knowledge. The other basic element is heritage. It can be our language, what we can be found in a museum. There's a culture between that's. We cannot even say there is a link between feminism, culture, and ecology. No, because it's not something separate. At the end of the day, this is kind of complicated, and this is a linguistic matter, because people can stop creating more words for everything and adding more words, and that, at the end of the day, prevents us from having holistic views of culture. We need a systemic vision. There's an interrelationship between the right to information, the right to education, and the right to heritage. There's a very strategical link, which is essential. And every time that you have a problem, you have an issue, you will have this link. This is the same case with sustainability. In essence, I could propose it's essential that we attain considering culture goes with it, but I would say whether we create a sector of the entertainment industry and culture, and that would have a negative impact on the sector, or we create cultural dimensions. So let's do talk about the different cultural dimensions of the different rights. Let's do that. And we need to take into account that we all have different rights and obligations. And not only we need to work from the, let's say, political means, but also economical means, social means. So we not only need to take into account sustainability, but above everything, we need to be inclusive with everyone. We need to include all kinds of knowledges, and so we will also include sustainability, necessarily.
Parce qu'il sera conforme à la réalité de l'écologie, à la réalité d'une économie beaucoup plus intelligente que celle que nous connaissons, à la réalité de cohésion sociale.
Because we will create different realities than we know, more dynamic realities. Because we will, from that moment on, be based on realities that are always changing. Reality can be hyper-modern. We always think that we can be more intelligent than we are. We're already really intelligent, but we need to be working on that. We need to be making the most of people with different kinds of knowledge to recognize, to acknowledge different realities. That's the only way of logically sustaining these new realities. And everyone will give it the configuration that benefits them the most. But we need to define cultural dimensions. At the end of the day, we do different things. Our jobs influence what we are. If we're a mother, if we're a father, that has an impact as well. In brief, I think we have challenges ahead. We have quite a lot of experience, and I want to say thank you to Jordi Pascual for everything he has done, for his great job, for all the data he has collected. And this is not, let's say, possible globally, but we can do it in some places. With these, I say that we need to start trying. I like the concept of demonstrating. Because we make good policies, we need logic, adequate, strict, specific words. And only if we do it that way, we can succeed. Thank you very much.
Lucina, also from your experience in politics and management of this defending the cultural dimension, but especially in this conflict that you were talking about, this challenges, feminism, migration, rural communities, communities that are far away from the cities. How can we do it? So these communities, well, these sectors, dialogue among them in terms of interculturality and not generating ghettos of diversity. Each of them in their cultural infrastructure. I'd like to talk about a conversation we had some days ago in La Sierra, in a community, in an indigenous community. Before they were called Huicholes, then they self-recognized, and they went to see. They did some rituals to bring balance to the world. They are convinced that we should rebuild the world. And one of these practices was giving of offerings, to link human beings and nature. But after that, they decided this was okay, but we also need a justice plan. And this justice plan means that we need to recognize our own rights as something contemporary. The Mexican society shouldn't see us as something in the past that should be exposed, but we are actors. We can have a say in this project. And one thing they said was that they had the right to take the most out of their resources, and how that could be translated into management, ways to manage their own natural resources, bio resources, and their knowledge, and all these elements. The second thing they talked about was that there was a need to rethink the land, but also the need to establish an education that was formal in art, because art belongs to daily life. And they talked about the need to design an education program that combined both aspects and bringing their knowledge. I'm giving this example because what they're asking for actually is to be in many other spaces, many other places, because the rights can be defended when they are executed. And they're currently trying to see if these dialogues can be put into practice. And the sectors without this modern concept, for them is absurd. It doesn't make sense, because they manage life in a different way. It's not, they don't have ministries. They have their own organization. And I think that's an example that is built from the ground, from their knowledge. But their understanding is from this point of view on how can they make the kids in their community to have a dignity in their life, recognizing their identities. On the other hand, I also think that lately, through the experiences that the 2021 agenda in culture, it has a program that suggests different kinds of governance that allow dialogue to happen. I'm going to mention Mérida, a city in the south of Mexico. This analysis brought light to the unbalance there was never an infrastructure in the south. A policy for New Balance, to have that policy, we needed to create the infrastructure so the community could create their experiences in that infrastructure. So it is built from a different perspective. It's not to bring something in there and distribute it, but for it to be the recipient where a new relationship is built. But we needed a policy that said why the policies that were in place aren't beneficial now for artistic systems. So here there was a tool created that allowed cultures to have a different kind of relationship in terms of management. And I think many of these tiny experiences can develop new possibilities for it to become practical. The same happens with another project I participated in, a project about water as a resource, but also as a economical function and many other aspects. And we were sitting midwives, the responsible for the water provision, and they were asking water, why, for what, from where, and the question is cultural, even though the project was economic. The question is cultural. Yeah, to wrap it up, I had a last question for Jordi. The community art practices and many educational projects have had this philosophy for a long time. They understand it as a collective work, challenge, water, nature. So, Jordi, how are we making this a process? There are examples of what a good orientation could be, policy-wise. And this aspect that Patrice emphasizes that much, but as well as learning from other cultural standpoints. How can we systemize this project?
You're not going to like my answer, because we don't really know how to do that. So during the last year, I've been participating in several projects, checking education files, because I think in our context we have great experiences. We have the Escuela Moderna, the sea school, the mountain school, several different kinds of schools, and with different methodologies and ways of learning. I believe that these are discussions that are happening at the hearts of different schools, because they don't have enough data. It's very necessary not only to file all information, but to find new methodologies and to systematize them, as you say, to create systems, because it's a tool that can help us to implement, or not to replicate, but to maybe use as an inspiration, use as like a recipe. Imagine, for example, my mom made great Spanish omelette, and when she gave me the recipe, I just adapted to myself. And you can do the same thing with our projects. You can inspire yourself on the work of other people. And I think it's a shame that we don't have files as a citizen. I am saying it's a shame that I don't have access, we don't have information in the archives of all the work that was done. And I don't want my boss to hear this, but I think it's essential that from Manifesta and from education, I think this should be something that we discuss, what happened with those archives, and not to let them die, but to, let's say, give them a new life through new policies. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. What? So early. Okay, we could be like all day talking about this, but we're going to ask our participants to say if they want to give us one last reflection. The idea is that the people that we're here today will leave this theater inspired. So, Patrice? Finally, I would like to talk about the exchange of new practices. Yes, this is a good idea, but we still have a long way to go. The citizens need to participate more actively and to look at society and to see what works, what doesn't work, and why. Also, of course, the analysis of what's universal, it's very important, but also we need to know what's singular, what's specific of every day. We worked in the Network 21, and we have some representatives here. For example, we made maps and investigating what different centers and hospitals did, and that's how we learned to work with different parties and to have, let's say, holistic visions, because at the end of the day, only exchanging knowledges, we will be able to understand what kind of gender problems exist, what kind of political problem exists, colonialism, which is something, a phenomenon that still exists. Many issues that we have now stem from the fact that we are not exchanging knowledge. And we need to know what our similarities and our differences. Yes, well, I think right now, well, going back to the first question that you asked about legality, about law, I think we are in context where we have precedents in our legislations about the defense of human rights. And in several countries, some legal proceedings have been won. I believe this is extremely important because it means that we have tools that are linked to the creation of jurisprudence that already exists. So we have new legal experiences. I believe some of them are quite important. We have also different charters in different cities about cultural rights that can have an operational governance dimension, but that also inflict on the organization of the citizenship. I talk about this a little bit. I believe that currently there are several social movements that are developing even activism actions that are linked to different causes, feminism, politics, ecology. You have 1 minute left. And, well, I believe these movements of the civil society, we need to strengthen them, to support them, and to create a different way of recognizing them and to have a relationship with them. Jordi, you have 30 minutes. Okay, I'm going to try to be practical. Let's talk about how can we guarantee access within this community. I gave several examples. We also have my manifest. We need to, from the starting point, from the design of the policies, we need to involve the citizenship. That means the citizenship also needs funding. And so every time we have a project, we need to involve the citizenship from the very first step, so they have a sense of ownership. This is how, finally, the citizenship owns this kind of project. Yes, we need to be with them at first, accompany them, but at the end of the day, it's their thing. Okay, so we're going to leave and going to empower the citizenship. We will be back soon.